guiltless mind cannot suffer. That is one of the great lines from this reading today. Chapter 5, Healing and Wholeness. Section 5, the ego's use of guilt. Here we go. Perhaps some of our concepts will become clearer and more personally meaningful if the ego's use of guilt is clarified. The ego has a purpose just as the Holy Spirit has. The ego's purpose is fear because only the fearful can be egotistic. The ego's logic is as impeccable as that of the Holy Spirit because your mind has the means at its disposal to side with heaven or earth as it elects. But again, remember that both are in you. In heaven there is no guilt because the kingdom is attained through the atonement which releases you to create. The word, quote, create, unquote, is appropriate here because once what you have made is undone by the Holy Spirit, the blessed residue is restored and therefore continues in creation. What is truly blessed is incapable of giving rise to guilt and must give rise to joy. This makes it invulnerable to the ego because its peace is unassailable. It is invulnerable to disruption because it is whole. Guilt is always disruptive. Anything that engenders fear is divisive because it obeys the law of division. If the ego is the symbol of the separation, it is also the symbol of guilt. Guilt is more than merely not of God. It is the symbol of attack on God. This is a totally meaningless concept except to the ego, but do not underestimate the power of the ego's belief in it. This is the belief from which all guilt really stems. The ego is the part of the mind that believes in division. How could part of God detach itself without believing it is attacking him? We spoke before of the authority problem as based on the concept of usurping God's power. The ego believes that this is what you did because it believes that it is you. If you identify with the ego, you must perceive yourself as guilty. Whenever you respond to the ego, you will experience guilt and you will fear punishment. The ego is quite literally a fearful thought. However ridiculous the idea of attacking God may be to the sane mind, never forget that the ego is not sane. It represents a delusional system and speaks for it. Listening to the ego's voice means that you believe it is possible to attack God and that a part of him has been torn away by you. Fear of retaliation from without follows because the severity of the guilt is so acute that it must be projected. Whatever you accept into your mind has reality for you. It is your acceptance of it that makes it real. If you enthrone the ego in your mind, your allowing it to enter makes it your reality. This is because the mind is capable of creating reality or making illusions. I said before that you must learn to think with God. To think with him is to think like him. This engenders joy, not guilt, because it is natural. Guilt is a sure sign that your thinking is unnatural. Unnatural thinking will always be attended with guilt because it is the belief in sin. The ego does not perceive sin as a lack of love, but as a positive act of assault. This is necessary to the ego's survival because as soon as you regard sin as a lack, you will automatically attempt to remedy the situation, and you will succeed. The ego regards this as doom, but you must learn to regard it as freedom. The guiltless mind cannot suffer. Being sane, the mind heals the body because it has been healed. The sane mind cannot conceive of illness because it cannot conceive of attacking anyone or anything. I said before that illness is a form of magic. It might be better to say that it is a form of magical solution. The ego believes that by punishing itself, it will mitigate the punishment of God. Yet even in this, it is arrogant. It attributes to God a punishing intent and then takes this intent as its own prerogative. It tries to usurp all the functions of God as it perceives them because it recognizes that only total allegiance can be trusted. The ego cannot oppose the laws of God any more than you can, but it can interpret them according to what it wants, just as you can. That is why the question, quote, "What do you want?" unquote, must be answered. You are answering every minute and every second, and each moment of decision is a judgment that is anything but ineffectual. Its effects will follow automatically until the decision is changed. Remember, though, that the alternatives themselves are unalterable. The Holy Spirit, like the ego, is a decision. Together they constitute all the alternatives the mind can accept and obey. The Holy Spirit and the ego are the only choices open to you. God created one, and so you cannot eradicate it. You made the other, and so you can. Only what God creates is irreversible and unchangeable. What you made can always be changed, because when you do not think like God, you are not really thinking at all. Delusional ideas are not real thoughts, although you can believe in them, but you are wrong. The function of thought comes from God and is in God. As part of his thought, you cannot think apart from him. Irrational thought is disordered thought. God himself orders your thought because your thought was created by him. Guilt feelings are always a sign that you do not know this. They also show that you believe you can think apart from God and want to. Every disordered thought is attended by guilt at its inception and maintained by guilt in its continuance. Guilt is inescapable by those who believe they order their own thoughts and must therefore obey their dictates. This makes them feel responsible for their errors without recognizing that, by accepting this responsibility, they are reacting irresponsibly. If the sole responsibility of the miracle worker is to accept the atonement for himself, and I assure you that it is, then the responsibility for what is atoned for cannot be yours. The dilemma cannot be resolved except by accepting the solution of undoing. You would be responsible for the effects of all your wrong thinking if it could not be undone. The purpose of the atonement is to save the past in purified form only. If you accept the remedy for disordered thought, a remedy whose efficacy is beyond doubt, how can its symptoms remain? The continuing decision to remain separated is the only possible reason for continuing guilt feelings. We have said this before, but did not emphasize the destructive results of the decision. Any decision of the mind will affect both behavior and experience. What you want, you expect. This is not delusional. Your mind does make your future, and it will turn it back to full creation at any minute if it accepts the atonement first. It will also return to full creation the instant it has done so. Having given up its disordered thought, the proper ordering of thought becomes quite apparent. All right. So this section, again, is called The Ego's Use of Guilt. It's emphasizing, once again, the power of the mind, the great power of the mind. So the ego is there. Heaven and earth are set before you. The ego, which is associated with fear and guilt and sin, and the Holy Spirit, which is associated with forgiveness, love, release, freedom. Now, we can't, Jesus keeps emphasizing that we can't underestimate the power of the mind. The mind, it can go both ways. It's up to us, and it's constantly the choice that, we're constantly choosing one or the other in every moment. He says this here. We're choosing, to follow the ego, or we're choosing the Holy Spirit. There's only two choices. There's only those two choices. Jesus is making it very simple for us. There's only those two choices, and we're choosing in every moment. And if we choose the ego, that choice, that decision, will not be, we won't get out of that choice. That choice will have ramifications and consequences and effects until we make another decision. We decide for the Holy Spirit. So this is a very important point, that we can get off on an ego trip, so to speak. We could follow the ego, we could get into the guilt, unworthiness, the shame, the blame, the all the other things, all the other trappings of the ego. And in doing that, we set ourselves back, and we suffer, in a real sense. We suffer the consequences of that choice until we choose the Holy Spirit, which is, there is no guilt, there is only love, there's no judgment. God does not judge. Only the ego's conception of God judges, and the ego fears the attack of God, and so it attacks for it. Jesus says something really interesting here, which is the ego believes that by punishing itself, it will mitigate the punishment of God. Yet even in this, it is arrogant. It attributes to God a punishing intent, and then takes this intent as its own prerogative. Meaning that the ego thinks that God, siding with the ego, we think, let's just say, when we side with the ego, when we listen to the ego, the voice of the ego, we punish ourselves because on some level we think that by doing that we will lessen God's retribution or punishment against us. But that's the ego's conception of what God is. God does not punish or judge. And so basically we hurt ourselves for nothing. We punish ourselves for nothing. We suffer for nothing. There's another kind of funny play on words line here, and I'm going to read it. It's Jesus says, "Guilt is inescapable by those who believe they order their own thoughts and must therefore obey their dictates. This makes them feel responsible for their errors without recognizing that by accepting this responsibility, they are reacting irresponsibly. If the sole responsibility of the miracle worker is to accept the atonement for himself, and I assure you that it is, then the responsibility for what is atoned for cannot be yours." The sole responsibility of the miracle worker, which is you and which is me, is to accept the atonement for oneself. That's the most important thing. All else will follow and flow from that choice to accept the atonement. What is the atonement again? The atonement is the idea that separation never happens. It's impossible to be separate from God. We have never been separate from God. We are still one with God right now. We have merely forgotten, and we can return home to that remembrance and that knowing at any moment. And it can happen like that if you want it, if you really want it. The wink of an eye. That's the atonement principle. So to accept that principle is huge. If you really accept that and bring that into every moment, it changes everything. It will, ultimately change your whole perception of everything, and you will treat people only with love and kindness, gratitude and acceptance, versus attack and judgment and fear and distrust, mistrust. So anyway, I think that's good for tonight. The guiltless mind cannot suffer. Hey, let's go back to the guiltless mind cannot suffer. So if you, now remember, the ego is the home of guilt. It's the voice for guilt. If once the ego is out of the way, there is no more suffering for you and for those who you share this with, who are open to receiving. Guiltless mind cannot suffer. Guiltless mind cannot suffer. Guiltless cannot suffer. Thank you for tuning in, and see you next time, whenever that may be. Blessed journeying, Godspeed, and see ya on the flip flop.